Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture is a theoretical lecture on CloudFront, and it's really important to understand the key fundamentals of what a CDN is and what CloudFront is before we move on to the lab where we'll create our own CloudFront distribution. So let's get started. What is a CDN? Well, a CDN is a content delivery network, and it's a system of distributed servers, or a network of them, that deliver web pages and other web content to a user based on the geographic location of that user, as well as the origin of the web page and a content delivery server. So, what does that actually mean? Well, let's take this world map for example, and let's assume that I'm running a website out of the UK and that I'm serving this website to users all over the world. So here are my users. Now when the users go to access this web page, they're making the request to my web server, which is in the UK, and you're going to get different latencies. So people in Australia are going to have a much longer latency than say someone in India or someone in the United States or even someone in South America. And don't forget, the way the internet backbone work is that they're not direct straight lines to individual countries. They go across these undersea cables, which add even more latency. So it used to be that South Africa would be terrible latency, but they've run internet backbones that make it a lot quicker now to connect into the UK. So this is how it works without a CDN. We've got our users around the world. They're trying to access a web page or maybe a movie file in the UK, and they're having to go directly to the UK, pull that file down, and then bring it back to their home country. So let's talk about some key terminology around CloudFront. And the first thing you have to know about CloudFront is what an edge location is. And we talked about this in one of the previous sections, but an edge location is the location where content will be cached. Now, this is separate to an AWS region or availability zone. So there are edge locations all around the world at the moment, and they'll be in areas that there might not be a region, but there will be an edge location. And you can see where the edge locations are by going to AWS's website. I think there's over 50 currently. Now, what's an origin? Well, an origin is the origin of all files that the CDN is going to distribute. So in our case, the origin was that web server that was in the UK. Now, in terms of AWS, an origin can either be an S3 bucket, it can be an EC2 instance, it can be an elastic load balancer, or it could even be Route 53. But in most common cases, it's going to be S3 bucket, or it's going to be an EC2 instance, or perhaps an elastic load balancer with EC2 instances behind it. So our origin is simply where our original files are. Now, what's a distribution? Well, this is the name that's given to the CDN, which consists of a collection of edge locations. So when we create a new CDN sort of network with AWS, this is called a distribution. And so we're going to create a distribution in the lab in the next section or in the next lecture of the course. So what is a CDN and how does it work? So again, we've got our UK file server here. We've got our users all around the world. And now I'm going to have multiple users in multiple countries, and you'll see why in a second. So we've also got our edge locations. Now, edge locations are spread all across the world. There's over 50 of them currently. And let's see what happens when the first user makes a request to get our content. That request is going to go to an edge location, and essentially you're going to be using a distribution URL. And don't worry if that doesn't mean a lot to you. We're going to do that in the next lab. But you're going to make a request, and that's going to be routed first to your edge location. Your edge location is then going to see whether or not that object is cached at that particular edge location. So let's say it's a video file. Your user's trying to play a video file. They made a request. It's gone to your edge location, and your edge location does not currently have that cached, in that current location. So what the edge location does is it pulls it down from the S3 bucket, let's say that's based in Ireland. So it pulls it down to its local edge location, and then it caches it, and it caches it for the time to live, or TTL. And again, we're going to have a look at that in the next lab. So you might think, well, that's no quicker than when, my previous example. And you're right, it's not quicker for the first user. However, when the second user then goes to access that file's already downloaded to the edge location. It's being cached at that edge location for the length of time that's been specified by a TTL. So that user is now just pulling the file from their local edge location as opposed to pulling it down from the S3 bucket that's located in Island. And for this reason, it speeds up delivery of your image files and of your video files a lot quicker, provided they're being regularly accessed by different users. So it's only your first user who suffers this sort of performance penalty. The rest of your users in those regions that have edge locations can now access this file a lot quicker because it's been cached at that edge location. So Amazon CloudFront can be used to deliver your entire website, including dynamic, static, streaming, and interactive content using a global network of edge locations. Requests for your content are automatically routed to the nearest edge location, so content is delivered with the best possible performance. Amazon's CloudFront is optimized to work with other Amazon Web Services like Amazon's Simple Storage Service, S3, Amazon's Elastic Cloud Compute Service, EC2, which we're going to cover in the next section of the course, Amazon's Elastic Load Balancer, again we're going to cover that in the next section of the course, and Amazon's Route 53. Amazon CloudFront also works seamlessly with any non-AWS Origin server which stores the original definitive files of your versions. So you can actually have an Origin that's not hosted with AWS itself. You can have your own default Origin server. And again, we'll look at a little bit of that in the lab in the next lecture of the course. So some key terminology going into the next lecture. You're going to need to understand what a web distribution is. And web distribution is essentially used for websites, and this is opposed to an RTMP distribution. An RTMP is used for media streaming. In particular, it's used for Adobe Flash. So we will cover that in the next lecture of the course. So my exam tips going into the exam: understand what an edge location is. This is the location where content is going to be cached. This is separate to an AWS region or availability zone. Remember, there's over 50 edge locations currently in the world. Origin, this is the origin of the files that the CDN will be distributing. This can either be an S3 bucket, an EC2 instance, an Elastic Load Balancer, or Route 53. And remember that an origin does not even have to be with AWS. You can have your own custom origin servers. A distribution, that's the name that's given to the CDN, which consists of a collection of edge locations, and we will create a new distribution in the next lab. Now, distributions consist of the following. You can have two different types of distributions. You can have a web distribution, which is typically used for websites and is the most common one, or you can use RTMP, which is used for media streaming. And in the next lab, we're going to create our own web distribution. And there's a few other things you should know just going into the exam. Edge locations are not for read only. So in our example, we were talking about reading a media file. You can actually write new files to an edge location as well. So you can put an object to an edge location. That object will then be basically put back up to the original origin server. So it will be replicated back to the origin. And the other thing you should know is objects are cached for the life of the TTL. So you set a TTL on your objects, and that's how long they'll be cached at your edge locations. And if you do have an object that is cached at an edge location that's no longer relevant, you can clear the cache objects, but you are going to be charged for that. So objects will automatically expire after the TTL has finished. So if its TTL is 24 days, that object will then expire 24 days later. If, however, you've just done a big update to your video and you want everyone to access the new version of the object, you're going to have to go in and clear the cache from the CloudFront, and you're going to be charged for that, but it is definitely possible. Okay, that's it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture where we're going to create our first CloudFront distribution.